April 17, 1945, Camp Butner, North Carolina. The morning air carries the scent of southern pine and fresh-turned earth. But inside Barracks 47, 23 German women sit in perfect military formation on wooden benches, their gray Wehrmacht-Helferin uniforms pressed despite months of captivity. The fabric bears the eagle and swastika that once filled them with pride. Outside, American guards pace the gravel paths between identical wooden structures that stretch across the North Carolina countryside like a geometric nightmare. Hauptgefreiter. Ingrid Müller adjusts the collar of her auxiliary uniform one final time. At 22, she has worn this gray wool for 3 years, first as a communications operator in occupied France, then during the chaotic retreat through the Rhineland, and finally through the humiliation of surrender to American forces near the Siegfried Line. The uniform has been her second skin, her identity, her anchor to a cause she believed would reshape the world. The silver Wehrmacht eagle above her left breast pocket catches the morning light streaming through barred windows. Beside her, Obergefreiter Greta Hoffmann fidgets with the Red Cross emblem on her medical auxiliary sleeve. The 20-year-old nurse from Bavaria joined the Wehrmacht-Helferin in 1943, convinced she was serving a righteous cause by tending to German soldiers wounded in what she believed was a defensive war for the fatherland's survival. Her uniform bears stains that no amount of washing can remove. Blood from field hospitals, mud from hasty evacuations, and now the invisible weight of questions she has begun to ask herself during long nights in American captivity. These women are part of nearly 500,000 female auxiliaries who served the Wehrmacht during the war. They were never intended to be combatants, yet found themselves prisoners of war when the Reich collapsed. Unlike their male counterparts captured in North Africa during Germany's early victories, these women witnessed the Third Reich's death throes. They saw cities burning, refugees fleeing, and the terrible desperation of a regime's final months. Yet even in defeat, even in the comfortable captivity of American POW camps, they clung to their uniforms as the last tangible connection to a cause they had served with unwavering dedication. The morning routine at Camp Butner followed the same pattern for months. Wake at 600 hours. Roll call in the central courtyard. Work details in the camp laundry or kitchen. Evening lectures on American democracy that most prisoners attended with polite skepticism. The German women maintained their military bearing, their sense of order, their belief that somehow their sacrifice had meaning. They wrote letters to families in the bombed ruins of German cities, letters that spoke of honor, duty, and eventual vindication. But on this April morning, the routine would shatter like glass against iron truth. The camp commander, Colonel James Morrison, had received explicit orders from the War Department. All German prisoners of war would be assembled in the main recreation hall to view documentary footage recently compiled by Allied forces. The films contained evidence of Nazi concentration camps liberated by American, British, and Soviet troops. The screening was mandatory. Armed military police would be present. No prisoner would be permitted to leave until the film concluded. As the women filed into the recreation hall alongside nearly 1,000 male prisoners, whispers rippled through the crowd in rapid German. Propaganda, someone muttered. American lies to justify their war, another voice suggested. The women took their seats in the segregated section reserved for female prisoners, their gray uniforms a somber contrast to the Wehrmacht field gray worn by the men. They sat with the rigid posture that had been drilled into them during auxiliary training, chins raised, eyes forward, prepared to endure whatever psychological warfare their captors had planned. The hall darkened. A projector beam cut through cigarette smoke and nervous tension. On the screen appeared the title in stark black letters, Nazi Concentration Camps. The subtitle read, Documentary Evidence Compiled by Allied Forces. The narrator's voice, clinical and measured, began to describe locations with names that would echo through history. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. At first, the prisoners maintained their defiant composure. This was enemy propaganda, they told themselves. Elaborate Hollywood deception designed to break their morale. The same Americans who produced fantasies in their cinema factories were now manufacturing lies about the Reich. But as the footage continued, as the cameras moved through the camps with unblinking mechanical precision, the whispers of denial began to falter. Bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons barely recognizable as human beings. Mountains of shoes, spectacles, human hair, children with numbers tattooed on their arms, mass graves filled with contorted forms, American and British soldiers, battle-hardened men who had fought across Europe, visibly struggling to comprehend what they had discovered. Ingrid Müller felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Her hands, folded in her lap with military precision, began to tremble. She had served in occupied territories. She had seen German troops conducting security operations against partisans and undesirable elements. But this industrial machinery of death, this systematic extermination of human beings, including children, including families, this was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Greta Hoffmann's medical training made the footage even more horrifying. She recognized the signs of systematic starvation, of diseases allowed to spread unchecked, of deliberate neglect designed to kill. As a nurse, she had taken an oath to preserve life. The uniforms she wore bore the symbol of healing, yet they also bore the eagle and swastika that had presided over this mechanized slaughter. The film continued for what felt like hours. Testimony from survivors, statements from American officers who had liberated the camps, mountains of documentation recovered from SS headquarters, the clinical precision of the killing apparatus, the bureaucratic efficiency of genocide. The narrator's voice remained steady, factual, letting the images speak their terrible truth. In the darkened hall, the sound of sobbing began to emerge from the assembled prisoners. Not the theatrical weeping of propaganda victims, but the deep, wrenching sobs of people confronting the destruction of everything they had believed about themselves and their cause. Some prisoners shouted "Lügen," lies, but their voices carried no conviction. Others sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to reconcile their service with this evidence of industrial murder. When the lights finally came up, many prisoners remained seated, staring at the blank screen as if hoping the images would prove to have been a nightmare. Colonel Morrison stood before them, his face grave with the weight of history. He spoke in careful, heavily accented German. "You have served a regime that committed these crimes in your name. What you have seen is documented fact, witnessed by Allied forces and recorded for history. You must now decide who you choose to be." In the silence that followed, Ingrid Müller stood slowly. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She looked down at her uniform, the gray wool that had once filled her with pride, the eagle that had once symbolized strength, the insignia that had once marked her as a servant of what she believed was German honor. Now these symbols felt like weights dragging her toward an abyss of complicity. She reached for the brass buttons of her tunic with trembling fingers. Around her, other prisoners began to move. Greta Hoffmann stood next, her medical training providing clinical clarity about what needed to happen next. If they were to have any hope of spiritual survival, if they were to reclaim their humanity from the machinery of genocide, they had to shed these symbols of participation. The first button came free with a small metallic sound that seemed to echo through the silent hall. Then another, and another. The tunic fell open, revealing the simple white blouse underneath. Ingrid slipped the gray wool from her shoulders and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight of the fabric, but the weight of 3 years of service, of belief, of identity. Behind her, Greta had begun to remove her medical auxiliary jacket, the red cross that she had worn with pride, believing it represented her service to wounded German soldiers, now seemed tainted by association with the regime that had committed these atrocities. Other women followed, their movements deliberate but shaking as if they were performing surgery on their own souls. The men began to follow their example. Wehrmacht field gray, Luftwaffe blue, Kriegsmarine uniforms, the symbols of military service that had defined their identities, began to accumulate on the recreation hall floor. Some prisoners wept openly as they undressed themselves of their former allegiance. Others maintained grim silence, their faces carved from stone. Silence, their faces carved from stone. American guards wheeled metal drums into the hall. The instruction came in broken German. Burn them. Destroy the symbols. Begin the process of choosing who you will become after witnessing this truth. The drums were filled with the gray and blue and black fabric of Nazi military service, and matches were distributed among the prisoners. Ingrid Müller struck the first match. The small flame danced in her palm, fragile and bright. She looked at her uniform one final time. The pressed wool, the brass buttons, the eagle that had once soared in her imagination as a symbol of German resurgence. Now she saw it for what it had truly been, the uniform of a regime that had built factories for killing human beings. She dropped the match. The flame caught the wool with surprising eagerness, as if the fabric itself wanted to burn away the weight of what it had witnessed. Other matches followed. Soon the drums blazed with the gray smoke of burning uniforms, the acrid smell of wool and brass and dissolving dreams. The smoke rose toward the recreation hall's high ceiling, carrying with it the last physical remnants of their service to the Third Reich. But even as the uniforms burned, questions remained. What had they known? What had they chosen not to see? How had they convinced themselves that their service was honorable, while this industrial murder operated in the same territories where they had worked? The flames could consume the symbols, but the reckoning with their own complicity would take much longer. Greta Hoffmann watched her medical auxiliary jacket turn to ash and felt the weight of every German soldier she had treated, every wound she had cleaned, every life she had helped preserve so that man could return to fight for a regime that was simultaneously murdering children. Her hands, trained to heal, had served a cause that specialized in killing. The contradiction would haunt her for the rest of her life. As the flames consumed the last of the uniforms, something else began to burn in the assembled prisoners. Not the fire of destruction, but the slower, more painful fire of recognition. They had been given a choice that went beyond symbols and uniforms. They could continue to deny what they had seen, to construct elaborate justifications for their service, to blame others for crimes committed in their nation's name, or they could begin the difficult work of acknowledging their participation in a system that had committed unprecedented evil. The smoke from the burning uniforms cleared, leaving the prisoners standing in simple civilian clothes, white blouses, plain trousers, the basic garments of ordinary human beings stripped of military identity. In this moment of nakedness, both literal and spiritual, they confronted the fundamental question that would define the rest of their lives. Who would they choose to become after witnessing the truth about what they had served? In the weeks that followed, Camp Butner became a laboratory for human transformation. Some prisoners, freed from the weight of their uniforms and forced to confront the reality of Nazi crimes, began to engage with their American captors' attempts at re-education. They read books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and other authors whose writings had been condemned as degenerate by the regime they had served. They participated in discussions about democracy, individual rights, and the responsibility of citizens in a free society. Others struggled with the cognitive dissonance between their lived experience of military service and the evidence of systematic murder. They had served alongside decent German soldiers who had shared their rations, their letters from home, their hopes for survival, and return to families. How could they reconcile their personal experience of honor and camaraderie with the institutional evil of the regime they had served? Some never could. They returned to Germany carrying the burden of unresolved questions about their own moral complicity. But for women like Ingrid and Greta, the burning of their uniforms marked the beginning of a different kind of education. Without the gray wool and brass buttons that had defined their identity for years, they were forced to discover who they were beneath the symbols of military service. They began to write letters home that spoke not of honor and duty, but of shame and the necessity of reckoning with terrible truths. They prepared themselves to return to a Germany that would need to confront its own complicity in industrial murder. The symbolic power of burning their uniforms extended far beyond the individual act of renunciation. These women had served a regime that had promised to restore German greatness through military conquest and racial superiority. They had believed they were part of a historic mission to create a 1,000-year Reich that would bring order and prosperity to Europe. The flames that consumed their uniforms also consumed these grand illusions, leaving them with the more modest, but more honest task of rebuilding their lives based on acknowledgement of truth rather than service to ideology. The abundance they encountered in American captivity, the regular meals, the medical care, the recreational opportunities, the basic respect for their humanity even as prisoners, stood in stark contrast to the systematic dehumanization they had witnessed in the concentration camp footage. American democracy, which they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent, had created a society prosperous enough to feed its enemies generously, while Nazi efficiency had created factories for killing children. This contrast between American abundance and Nazi brutality became a touchstone for their understanding of political systems. A country that could afford to treat its prisoners well, that could provide them with recreational activities and educational opportunities even during wartime, represented a fundamentally different approach to organizing human society than the regime that had required industrial murder to maintain its vision of racial purity. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, as the war ended and the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable, even to the most committed believers, the women who had burned their uniforms at Camp Butner faced the prospect of return to a Germany that would need to rebuild not just its cities and its economy, but its moral foundation. They would return without their gray Wehrmacht-Helferin uniforms, but carrying something more valuable. The painful knowledge of what they had served and the responsibility to ensure such service was never again rendered by future generations. The burning uniforms had been more than an act of renunciation. They had been a ritual of transformation, a ceremony marking the death of one identity and the difficult birth of another. In the smoke and flames, these women had cremated their service to organized evil and begun the work of discovering what it might mean to serve human dignity instead. Years later, long after Camp Butner had been converted to other uses, long after the prisoners had returned to rebuild Germany as a democratic nation allied with its former enemies, the memory of that April afternoon would remain vivid. The smell of burning wool, the weight of brass buttons in trembling hands, the terrible silence after the film ended, the choice between denial and acknowledgement, between the comfort of maintained innocence and the burden of recognized complicity. For women like Ingrid Müller and Greta Hoffmann, the burning of their Nazi uniforms represented the most important moment of their lives, not because it was heroic, but because it was necessary. In a world where evil had been organized with bureaucratic efficiency, where mass murder had been conducted with industrial precision, where ordinary people had been recruited to participate in unprecedented crimes, the simple act of removing the symbols of that participation and committing them to flames became an essential ritual of moral reclamation. The fire that consumed their uniforms was not the fire of purification. Their complicity could not be so easily cleansed, but the fire of acknowledgement. By burning the gray wool and brass buttons, by standing in simple civilian clothes before the evidence of what they had served, they chose to confront the truth about themselves and their nation, rather than retreat into comfortable denial. In the end, this choice, to burn their uniforms to acknowledge the reality of Nazi crimes, to begin the difficult work of moral reckoning, would prove more significant than any military service they had rendered. The flames that consumed their Wehrmacht-Helferin insignia also illuminated a path forward, not toward redemption, which could not be earned, but toward a different way of living that began with facing terrible truths rather than hiding from them. The women who burned their Nazi uniforms at Camp Butner in April 1945 discovered that freedom was not the absence of constraints, but the presence of choice, the choice to acknowledge evil rather than deny it, to accept responsibility rather than claim innocence, to rebuild rather than retreat. In the smoke of their burning uniforms, they glimpsed the possibility of becoming something other than servants of organized hatred. Whether they would succeed in that transformation would depend on choices yet to be made. But the first choice, to burn the symbols of their participation in evil, had been made with trembling hands beside metal drums filled with gray wool and dying dreams. The fire burned until only ash remained, and in that ash lay the remnants of an ideology that had promised greatness through domination, and delivered instead a factory system for producing corpses. What rose from those ashes would be determined by the choices these women made in the days and years that followed. But the burning itself marked the end of one story and the possible beginning.